Hello, everyone. Today I'm going to be talking to Erik Thor, who is one of the most well-known Neojungian typologists in the world. Are you the only Neojungian typologist in the world, or are there others?
Honestly, there is one other person that I know that is established and who came to originate the term, and that's Christian Johansson at
Yes.
neojungiantypology.com.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where the term comes from. So for him, Neojungian typology was an effort that anyone can have to connect Jungian psychology to modern psychology and to the insights and developments in neuroscience and in genetics to understand psychology and psychological type.
I see. And what caused you to go and set up your own website, erikthor.com?
It was a difference in approach. Like I learned a lot working with Christian, and he is really intelligent and really good with systems, and he has a very computational perspective on the human mind. Like to him, the human mind is basically like a computer. Everything is different functions, everything is different tasks and processes working together as one. But to me, the human mind is a little bit more like a flower in a sense. So it's like archetypes that have nuances and that cannot be completely defined or logically defined 100% because their form is too complex to capture just with a good definition or so. So my perspective is much more qualitative, where his approach is a little bit more quantitative. But I like both approaches.
That makes sense. I guess also you identify being a feeler.
Yes, I do. And I see for me, the biggest and most significant thing about typology is to understand personal growth.
Right.
So how do people really feel? What drives people? What are people's underlying motivations and interests?
And that makes sense. I mean, I think, I suppose, say from the socionics perspective, motivations are a very important part, and understanding those values, understanding not necessarily entirely to behavior, but why people engage in such behavior.
Yeah, I believe that's the essence of personality, our motivation. Our behavior can change from situation to situation, but our motivations tend to be relatively consistent, like throughout our life. They can improve and we can shift and we can slightly change our approach to how we achieve them. But we tend to have certain interests and motivations that tend to be key themes throughout most of our life.
Yeah, I would agree. I guess one thing that makes me wonder is if these motivations are to say consistent, how do you also preserve that flower quality, that more fuzziness around our motivations?
So what I've done is I've taken a big look at Carl Jung's theory on the 12 archetypes. So I believe there are certain characters or images that have existed throughout most of human history and all across the world, like the caregiver, the healer, the magician, the innocent, the every person. And I believe those are deeply connected to what we study today as cognitive functions. So I believe the archetypes are a good way to study the cognitive functions in the way that they can paint a picture of like different myths that surround these cognitive functions and different people throughout history that have represented these functions and different roles that we can recognize all over the world in slightly different forms and variations, sure, but still we can see they're all part of the same core original archetype.
So, in a way, the definition comes from that sort of transcendental, deeply symbolic meaning, which we, in sort of in our, to go Jungian or neo-Jungian, our collective unconscious can almost instinctively recognize.
Yeah, I think they touch very deeply upon the collective unconscious. Like these ideas are so primal in us, they are deeply rooted in our genetics and in our psychology. Like we inherit these images as kind of frameworks for life. So they essentially represent like our guidebook. Like when we meet and interact with people, and when we interact with the world, we do so by pulling on our past experiences, our family, our parents, and their parents, and their parents before them, and their ideas and their experiences as caregivers, or as rulers, or as innocents or so.
Yes, and that's, I mean, there's also this idea seems to be very similar to rather similar development, at least in the last few years. On, I don't you know much about Beebe's model, which seemed to have built on the old Myers-Briggs four stack to create 8 cognitive functions that had to explore the shadow. I was wondering how much of the theory you and Christian were working on together, how much has Beebe's model influenced that? Or was it something which you came about completely independently from Beebe?
So I've come to distance myself a lot from Beebe's work over time. Though initially I think almost everyone uses some version of Beebe's ideas today, and those have become very popular. I came to distance myself from the idea of compartmentalizing the psyche in the way he does, by talking of one dominant function and one auxiliary function, and one child, and one anima, and so on. I believe that it's hard to, and it's difficult to classify the psyche into these very small parts, because I believe the human mind is a combination of different parts. We're more like Lego in a sense, like we are different things added together as one. And those things are very hard to separate. So I tend to group functions together as flow functions, as inspirational functions, autopilot functions, and as you could say weaknesses or stressors.
So that also, I'm a little bit puzzled in that respect, just because if we just looking at Beebe's model, you have they're meant to function almost as sub personalities, different elements coming together to create the same person, which can cause a person in their complexity to act in a very unusual sort of manner. Say, looking at the animus, I think it's something which I had just to be clear, had a great fortune to go into the British Association for Psychological Type conference, and I've only recently gotten back. And Richard Owen, who was very much a BBist, you could say, he went through using example of Russell Brand and how Russell Brand's behavior showed all different sorts of complexity and variation, based on these very different archetypes all working together to create the overall personality. So so what makes me wondering is how is that sort of more steel man form of Beebe's model? How is that? How does that compare, or how does it contrast to your own approach of taking these functions form the flow type? Let's say for myself, I mean, I took your flow test just today, and got ENTP, at least in your system, and I'd imagine that would be for me extroverted intuition, extroverted thinking, intuitive perceiving, and thinking perceiving. So how does that approach contrast with this idea of different archetypes coming together within me? My hero, my parent, my critical parent, my demon, my trickster. Is that how does one offer greater nuance or complexity than the other?
So the thing is, I believe that the individual psyche is very personally developed. You know, we can group people into 16 distinct types, and we can say to some extent what flow is for an ENTP. And we can say that usually when ENTPs are in flow, they are engaging in extroverted intuition, extroverted thinking, intuitive perceiving, and thinking perceiving. And we can see those functions manifest themselves. Now, I think it's possible to do what BB does and go and divide the parts of this and say extroverted intuition might be the hero and extroverted thinking might be another very core aspect or archetype. However, I've come to focus my studies on the wholes and how it all connects to each other's, simply to keep things practical and to keep things to make the study easier and to be able to not overwhelm myself by data and definitions. You know, if you break down the psyche into too many parts and focus too much on the parts, you miss the whole. So I had to say, okay, I have to look at the whole and how they all interact together. So that's why I came to make this distinction for the ENTP, that they had 4 flow functions, 4 stressors, 4 autopilot functions, and 4 inspirational functions.
I think that's the part which I missed out on from reading through your website. I didn't see, at least in my profile, I didn't see much attention to the inspirational and autopilot functions. Would I be correct in saying that for me that my stressor functions would be introverted sensation, sensing, judging, introverted feeling, and feeling judging? Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. Actually, for an
Yeah.
ENTP, the stressors are introverted feeling, feeling judging, introverted sensing, and sensing judging.
Oh, is there? That's nothing. Is there a very clear reason for the order of these
It's all made quite logical in using the MBTI original type code. How I work with it is your first 4 letters represent your flow functions if you group them 2 by 2.
Yes.
And the opposite 4 letters represent your stress functions if you group them 2 by 2.
Yeah.
The inspirational functions represent a person who has the same values and interests and motivations as you, but different attitudes. Like they might be introverted and they might be judging.
So would that be like introverted intuition, introverted thinking, intuitive judging, and thinking judging?
Yeah, like you can talk about introverted judging, you can talk about intuitive thinking as well as a part of this. But when I talk about cognitive function, I usually say it's a combination of 1 value and 1 attitude. So either introversion or extroversion paired with intuition and sensing, or it can be judging and perceiving compared with, for example, feeling and thinking.
So does that mean that when it comes to discussing these inspirational functions, it's not really all 4 of them? It's more, it all considers one overall gestalt. Is that what you meant?
Yeah, like all cognitive functions come together as one. Like the ENTP is only as extroverted and intuitive as they are extroverted and thinking, and as they are thinking and perceiving, and as they are intuitive and perceiving. So when you study a function, and this is where a lot of tests go wrong, you know, they, especially the ones that only rely on the simplest dichotomies, the ones that say, oh, you're either introverted or you're extroverted, or you're either intuitive or you're sensing. What they miss is you have extroverted sides and you have introverted sides, and you have intuitive sides and you have sensing sides. So you will relate to some aspects as an ENTP of intuition, but not all of them. And when it starts bounding too much into feeling, or when it starts bounding too much into judging, or when it becomes too long term into the future, or when it becomes too deep and too far in to the unconscious, it starts to alienate you as an ENTP.
Okay, now that is very interesting. So, for instance, I'd be just as much extroverted intuition as I'd be extroverted thinking in the idea of flow type.
Yes.
Okay, and that's where I get a little bit puzzled because, for instance, looking through the more simplistic breakdown, I grant you it is quite simplistic because it's only single lines, and of course, in other profiles, you've gone to more depth, say on INFJ, your own profile. But for instance, when it goes here towards extra intuition, this part makes sense to me. Involved with transformation, change, and novelty. And that's the seeker function, part of the seeker archetype.
Yeah.
Whereas when it gets to extra thinking, it becomes the boss function. And it says involved with status, power, and authority. Now, when I come to think about my use of thinking, I wouldn't say that for me, a focus on status, power, authority is that prevalent. If anything, I'd say that, at least from my own personal experience, and well, you could of course disagree with me being an ENTP in your model. I mean, although I did take your test and you said it's a very accurate test. I would say that for me, the idea of status, power, and authority is something just more imposed upon me, something which I feel I have to do the things which I want. Say, for instance, to explore new ideas and possibilities in socionics. I wouldn't really, I'd rather not have to deal with the idea of having to push other people to one side and have authority over others to get engaged in these explorations. So when I see that the boss function there, and I don't, I feel have a feeling of dissonance with it rather than the sort of identity and alignment of identity I see with the other parts.
I completely understand that, and I'm completely aware right now that my definition of extroverted thinking, it takes it a bit too close to, for example, an ENTJ or an ESTJ, and a little bit too far from an ENTP or an ESTP at the moment. So the way I'm exploring this archetype is as kind of the challenger or the inspirational, strong example of the person that likes to, go ahead, set an example, to be the best at something, the one that's interested in competition or the idea of, proving one's power or gaining strength in something. Obviously, I feel ENTPs don't have a judging or a proactive preference in their thinking. So they won't relate to the idea of wanting to control people or wanting to structure people or wanting to manage in that dimension. So that part of the ruler doesn't fit them at all. But the way I'm taking it and what I'm discovering about the ruler archetype or the challenger archetype, or an archetype can have many different forms. I'm looking for the purest form that will fit truly with extroverted thinking without a bias towards either one type. So it's a very careful balance that I'm working through, but I'm getting there for sure.
So sort of like Neojungian typology is probably like all theories which are, are worth their salt, a work in progress.
For sure. And I'm just one person, and I see this as a many-year project. I foresee myself working with this 10, 20 years into the future.
Well, that's great. I think, if you have a passion, something you want to work on and, bring about great things with, I think that's an amazing thing. And it sort of you can line up your goals, as it were. That's a great thing to do.
That's why also I'm very happy that you invited me here, because I like when people start critically examining my work as well. And I definitely like and need feedback on the articles. And anyone who goes to my website can just leave if they see anything that they have a question about on the website or on the page, you can just leave me a question. There's a chat function right in the bottom right corner. So you can just say, hey, Eric, you misspelled this one, or did you really mean to say this? So
no, of course, I think that's a very good idea to be open to that feedback. But it also brings back to one of the reasons why I also wanted to reach out to you, that you're here working on developing a better model, a better way of envisioning Jungian type. And I guess, at least coming from a more socionics perspective, now I myself feel that socionics is again a work in progress. It is something which is aiming to be improved in some way in the long term. It's not set in stone. And I think whatever we can, whenever we're working with the mindset of developing this better typology, it would be probably best if we put our minds together and find a way to actually work forward towards something.
yeah.
Now, from my socionics perspective, looking at where you started from, that you started from the Myers-Briggs system, which, it has some of its difficulties. It's more dichotomy focused. It also doesn't make certain distinctions, such as the difference between values and strengths. I can see those two elements, especially, also showing up in the work you've done in terms of how you try to develop it. It seems to me that, for instance, your idea of the archetype seems very much based on the dichotomies rather than different positions of a cognitive functioning. and how those positions actually lead to certain differences in personality and different behavior in different situations. I haven't quite seen that differentiated yet in the way that it could be if we were in the different slots and positions in a stack. I also think, and also you can correct me on this one. What was I saying? Goodness. Oh yes. In terms of strengths and values, you put together your ideas of the ideal relationship, and you have three ideals. You have the soulmate, you have the best friend, and you have the more traditional relationship, as you say, which is the idea of pairing the opposite. Now, that one we've tended to call the dual. And in your description of that, you said that the difficulty with a dual relation is actually that they don't have an alignment of values. And so there isn't that more natural understanding, which seems unusual from my perspective, at least because I'm someone who thinks that actually these types do share in the same values. They just don't have the same capabilities and strengths. They have the same valued information elements, but they don't have the same strong information elements. And I was wondering what caused you to have this view that they don't share in these same values. Is it because of the different flow types and the idea that you've taken these, you essentially assigned only the, well, say for an NT, the intuitive and thinking to them, and for an SF, only the sensing and feeling functions to them?
Yeah. So I made a live stream actually yesterday with some people from Socionics, and we were discussing this in another stream. So I can recommend you all go check out. It's called Float State. It's by Damon Gray.
It was a very, very good video, actually. I thought it was very worthwhile. I remember it had Damon, it had Taylor Pakoki, also to check her out, and also you, and a good exploration of beta duality.
Yeah. So the way I see it, the duality relationship is definitely one of three common options. And I see a lot of ENFPs that date ISTJs, and I see a lot of ESTPs that date INFJs, and so on. So I definitely see it has its potential. It's not a relationship that I feel personally appeals to me. And here's where I believe that development plays a key perspective. I don't believe you can predict a person's strength or actual strength at using a function based on their personality type. You cannot predict ability using a personality system unless you have a personality system that only measures ability. Because such a system touches on development and things we can improve and work on throughout our life. It doesn't touch on something consistent that will remain relatively stable for a longer time. So beyond that, I think what it does touch on is perceived confidence in something. Like I do believe that INFJs have a perceived confidence in their own introverted intuition and their introverted feeling, just as an ENTP has a perceived confidence in extroverted intuition or extroverted thinking. However, that doesn't necessarily say anything about how good you are at this function. And if you meet somebody perhaps much older than you at a different maturity level, who has had a different background and development, perhaps a better one or a better upbringing or a better condition to develop, that person will obviously outmaneuver you in your flow functions, to say.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. I think that at least the way we tend to look at strength versus weakness is more of an intrapersonal thing rather than interpersonal. So the idea, for instance, that for you, your intuition is better than your sensation if you're an intuitive type, or if you're a thinking type, that your thinking be better than your feeling. But it has no bearing on how you necessarily relate to other people and who are maybe on very different tracks of development. I think instead, when it comes to development for socionics, at least, it's the idea that if you have that strength, say, in extra intuition, that would imply less of a confidence and less of an innate competence in something like introverted sensation. And that becomes an area you think, okay, this is somewhere where I may need a bit of help in, so I may need to develop. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, like you have the kind of egocentric hero myth, the person that becomes arrogant and very like self-assured in their own abilities. And essentially that person has this inflated sense of ability, or they believe that I can solve every single problem in life through my flow function. And I don't think that kind of person is ready for a dual relationship. For example, if a person has a very inflated sense of self-worth, I think they will be very pessimistic to meet somebody of the opposite type, because they will believe, what's the use in empathy? I've never cared for that as an ESTJ, why would I need or as an INFP, why would I need to do or deal with the system? I just want to go my own way and be my own person, So you have those conflicts that can come up if you come from this position of inflated ego, or if you're obsessed with your flow functions.
Yeah. So sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. But yeah, I think that there is something to be said about that. At least, and I probably apologize in advance to my fiance who might be watching and tuning in, because of course it's almost inevitable I bring her up in this conversation. But I have the good fortune of being engaged to someone who would probably in cognitive functions make sense as an ISFJ. And what I've noticed, at least, is that firstly, I think maturity is a big part of it.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that we would necessarily have clicked so easily at an earlier point in our life, at times. If I were acting out in the way that I was at the age of 16, I think I may have put her off, for instance. But at the same time, I think that, once you develop that sense of actually, I should be looking for something more than myself, rather than looking for a repetition of myself. And, we see people in their early relationships, they have tended to go towards people who are more like them. Later in later life, looking for people who are more different to them. Well, what I've noticed is that there is a whole wealth of shared values, but also these shared values are where I have sort of difficulty with how you're giving me the extroverted thinking. For instance, rather than an environment of competition or confrontation, I would say that what really brings me happiness with my fiance is actually just being able to relax and tune in, watch a movie, cuddle up on the couch, go for nice walks, and see nature, and all the sorts of embracing the day to day and enjoying it. And that's something which I don't do naturally, I should say. It doesn't really occur to me to go out for a walk and enjoy. If I'm left to my own devices, I'm usually in my head. I'm usually exploring different possibilities online. I'm usually engaging in different theoretical conversations. But it's sort of being exposed to that very different side of things, that more concrete side, but still a sort of a pleasant, very easygoing, very non-competitive environment. I've always found actually brings me great happiness.
Yeah.
So what do you think of that?
So the way I see it is, this is why we need to have a very dynamic approach to personality type. We cannot stereotype any definition or any cognitive function and say it's always like this in every single situation. And I definitely believe love can change a person and can change a person's perspective on many things. The way I would explain this, and I felt a similar change myself dating my ENFP girlfriend, in that while flow represents an intrinsic motivation, the opposite function can represent an extrinsic or external sense of happiness or energy, or it can represent a relief. It can be relieving if you are a naturally competitive type to meet somebody that doesn't care about status or doesn't see that or doesn't value or need that from you. And it can be that one point in your life where you can relax and where you can get relief and where you can just cuddle up and where you can just be yourself in a way, or just open up about things you would not open up to anyone else. And I think everyone needs like that. And I'm starting to go from where I used to have like a singular desire to say to everybody, just choose flow, just choose your dominant all the time. I've started to mature into a view where we need to pursue our dominant interests and motivations, but we also need to make sure we get relief from our stressors to make sure they don't take over us. And we also need to strive for something higher and from using our inspiration. We also need to tackle, life's daily chores and stressors in a healthy and balanced manner. And all those things in combination, those things bring happiness. When you're able to deal with all those four things in a healthy and happy way, that's when you feel at your best.
On that, I think there's a lot to agree with that. Although you did say again that I'd be someone who'd be more naturally focused on status and power, and that actually engaging with someone very different to me may be taking me away from this more natural preference. But again, I'm not sure that I have that motivation. You've also said before that maybe it's because you put in maybe too much thinking, judging into your extroverted thinking, and that may end up too much like an ENTJ or ESTJ. I guess it gets back to that question of what exactly is it about an ENTJ or ESTJ that makes them also focused on power and the focus on these hierarchies? What is it about thinking that is related to power?
So one thing I've done to distinguish between extroverted thinking and thinking and judging is I've called extroverted thinking and introverted feeling, for that matter, functions that have to do with reviewing or evaluating our circumstance and defining what we want and what we think is right and wrong and what we think is important in life. In that sense, I've also labeled extroverted thinking a pragmatic and what works-oriented function. If introverted thinking rests on principles and logic and critical thinking, extroverted thinking relies on observation, what actually works, what is actually the best way to do something, what resources do we have available, and how can we use them in the best way possible.
So that actually brings you back to Jung and his psychological types. And I very much agree with you that extroverted thinking has that focus on observation and pragmatism. He uses the example of Charles Darwin. Now, Darwin was able to put together his idea of evolution through a very rigorous process of observation, taking different samples, pulling them together, looking at them, trying to figure out how this all worked. Now, what I don't understand, though, is how that pragmatism, how that focus on what works, leads to a focus on status and power. They seem to me to be unconnected concepts, unless you could connect them for me.
I think after this conversation, I'm gonna have a look at this, and I'm gonna see how I can organize this, and how I can rewrite this. And I'm gonna get back to you about this. I think you might have a good point.
Thank you. Because as I say, because it's like it's from the socionics perspective, right? What you've come on to from an MBTI perspective is very insightful, because it aligns with an insight I found in socionics, and that's the idea of a demonstrative function. You heard of a demonstrative function?
Could you explain it to me?
Okay, so demonstrative function is meant to be just as strong as a leading function, but it's not meant to be valued. It's not done for its own sake. So what does that mean? So let's take the ENTP example. So extrovert intuition would be the leading function, so focus on lots of different possibilities, not wanting to commit to any one long-term outcome, and also a certain affinity with being able to see these possibilities, to be open to these different perspectives, to be led by those shiny things in the corner no one else is looking at. But when it comes to extroverted thinking, now the ENTP also shows this, the ability to take in factual information very well, and the ability to, problem solve, and be oriented towards the delivery of factual information and using it to make things work better. Now, where it's not a leading function is that it's not valued for its own sake. So an ENTP, unlike an ENTJ in the Socionics system, would be far less likely to, for instance, give lots and lots of factual information for the purpose of telling people how to do things better or advising people on how to do things better. They're less likely to get frustrated over impractical processes. Instead, it's something they just take in and they demonstrate rather well without that expectation that others sort of comply or conform to it. For me, my expectation of conformity more comes from expecting people to be interested in multiple things. And I usually get shocked when people aren't interested in the things I'm interested in talking about. But when it comes to extroverted thinking, I'm very easygoing in that respect.
That's a quite interesting analogy, and that's something that I've always felt connected to in socionics. I know Leon Sau and he kind of introduced me to the demonstrative function, though I didn't connect it immediately by name. He was also one that argued that INFPs, for example, have a very strong introverted intuition, and INFJs have a very strong introverted feeling. And I've always been a part of that camp, like where I see a lot of people focus on INFJs introverted thinking. The way I see it, an INFJ's introverted thinking is often a bad habit a lot of the time. Like it's more like a coping mechanism we fall into, like a rationalization we make, cooling down of our emotions. And often more unhealthy. I've always felt introverted feeling is a lot more prevalent in the INFJ. A bigger part of our reasoning.
I totally agree. So one thing I've noticed, say, a big difference between INFJ and ENFJ is that although they're both using extroverted ethics, they're both able to essentially persuade people with emotions. It's the INFJ who actually is far more comfortable working on the one-to-one for that, and actually forging them as more close personal relationships in order to sort of more subtly nudge them on the journey, nudge them towards the outcome. Whereas the ENFJ would rather sort of make a sort of more group or a more broadly perceived impact. And yeah, and also when I speak, even talking to my fiance, and supposedly an ISFJ, and you think the main focus would be introverted sensation. That's true. Very much a focus, at least in the Socionics definition, on sort of the flow and harmony in the moment, and really being absorbed in those day-to-day details. But there's also the fact that she's very aware of who she likes and who she doesn't like, who makes her feel uncomfortable, where does she get bad vibes from people. And then she knows, of course, okay, that person getting bad vibes for, she'll keep more of a distance. And indeed, before she actually goes into socialize in a new situation, she'll sort of hang back and sort of try to figure out who are people she can actually have good conversations with rather than awkward or unpleasant conversations. So you see that the introverted feeling coming a lot in what would be more of an ISFJ type. We call this an SEI type, of course.
Yeah, I see that in myself. I also see that I don't have necessarily the interpersonal skills that you would associate with an ENFJ or an ESFJ, or at least I'm not very confident and secure in my interpersonal skills. I think INFJs and ISFJs more often feel like the outsider of the group than as the group itself. Like we are one of the people that are trying to guide and help the group, but we are also not the kind of outsiders in the sense that we don't feel like a direct part of the group. People don't necessarily see us as the group itself or as the dynamic, or more like a person that they can confide in, a person that they can talk to, a person that sees them, and this is the individual level as well. Like we focus usually more on the emotions, the individual emotions of a person than on the group's feelings.
So sort of like rather than being the sort of person who sets the mood for the group, who is the clear leader or the clear evangelist of a group or the clear communicator, for you it's more that you're working at one-to-one level, and you more hang out more in the back. You will be more in the background in that respect. You won't jump to the foreground, but people will be able to approach you if they need to talk to someone on the one-to-one.
Yes, and I pull people aside as well to talk to them. So I tend to find people when they're alone, and I ask them like, how do you feel about this? And can I help you with anything? And do you need any support with this? And here's where I see introverted feeling as the archetype of the healer. A lot of the time, I tend to feel INFJs can take on a counseling role to other people. And that's one form of the healer, to focus on counseling another person. But it's all about, providing emotional reassurance, helping people through something difficult, or, just maintaining harmony. I think harmony is a value that a lot of INFJs and INFPs and others tend to latch on to quite strongly.
Now, it's interesting that you've tied introverted feeling to harmony. I've seen more MBTI people tie extroverted feeling to harmonizing, although I'd have a different view on the matter in terms of harmonizing. I wouldn't actually say that either feeling function is necessarily tied to becoming more harmonious and the sort of more fuzziness of emotions. I'd say that both feeling also has an access to the far more harsh and more what's the word, judgmental or more volatile aspects of feelings and personal sentiments and attitudes and emotions. And it's a question of what that feeling goes with that can often bring out the fuzziness.
Yeah. So when I say harmony, I often talk about it from the position of conflict and our position on conflict. Often I see it's quite common for introverted feeling types to take on a mediating role, focusing on making sure there is a balance in everyone's viewpoints, and that you could say people are able to come to an agreement on something, or that people are able to get along with something. But for me as an INFJ, something I've noticed in myself is I don't like conflict, and I feel drained very quickly in competitive environments. I can struggle when put in a position where people are focused on who will win, or who's the best, or who's the strongest, or who's the toughest. I can find those kind of environments very difficult. So in those environments, I tend to pull back a lot.
Now that is very interesting. Now that is very interesting because now I'm not going to assume you are an IEI in the socionic system. We can never make these assumptions of direct correlations. But one thing we would have expected from an IEI is that, although they're not very good at asserting themselves directly on the moment, and they tend to be so caught up in their heads and thinking about the long term, they have difficulty moving to action, they nevertheless benefit from a certain aggressive decisiveness from other people, and actually can take in that confrontation and be all what's the word, energized by it. But for you, it's interesting. But you actually, that seems to be very much a devalued aspect, and that you far prefer the more harmonious aspect of feeling, the idea of actually mediating with people, helping you to get along, helping people to feel better in and of themselves. Would that be correct?
Yeah. So what I've found is I've been in environments that have a lot of conflict in them. Like I've been in politics, and I've thrived in politics somehow. So I've been able to find a way through it. So I've often found myself in the eye of the storm, but I've never wanted to be a part of it, or the actual drama, or the actual conflict myself. So often in those situations, what I do is I introspect, and I try to focus on myself. And here's something I've noticed about myself: I have a very high amount of self-responsibility. So I focus on what I can do to make things better. I don't think about what the group can do to make things better, or how we as a people can change. I think about how I can change things.
And
So
that
what can I do to fix this conflict? What can I do to make things better? What can I do to solve the problem?
now that is again very interesting because, well, you're seeing yourself as the indicator of certain changes that can make things better. And also you have been able to handle these more confrontational, more aggressive aspects, say in politics. You could handle it, but you'd very much rather not be in those situations, and you'd avoid them if possible. Is that correct?
Nowadays, that's true, especially coming out of a burnout from those environments.
No, fair enough. So it's actually has a draining effect on you. That is interesting. No, that is no. I'll give that one more thought. Actually, I think I'll definitely give it one more thought. I wanted to answer some of the questions you asked me.
I had a question for you, actually. And
Yeah.
actually, that question was, how do you type people?
Yes, and that's one of the questions you actually sent to me.
Yeah.
So what I do is I basically, you may see some of my interviews, but basically I follow a organic flow of questions and answers. And whenever someone answers a question, I always see it as like along the flow of conversation, a shiny thing shows up. Something is interesting. There may be multiple shiny things. I have to remember where they are. And it's like navigating the conversation, seeing these little doors which are going to open and go into. So I then ask further questions on those places because I think they could have potential to lead somewhere else. Now, that's my approach. Other people may interview differently. But I've always found that if I ditch the written questionnaire, and I just go for actually just examining how people answer in the moment, I can get lots of better insights about type. And usually what I'm looking for is this. I'm looking for there's this division we make in sociology between strength and value is an important one. Now, strength, yes, is a lot to do with confidence rather than necessarily an objective competence and a competence which can be measured up against other people. It's either an intrapersonal strength or just a general confidence in that area. If that shows up, I can know where their strong areas are, whether that's more intuitive, sensory, logical, ethical. And if I can find that their values, that's also very helpful. We have this idea of these quadrants, these families of shared values. So if someone comes out as being more of an alpha value, that's someone who still likes the conveyance of emotions, but very much about harmony in the moment emotions. People feeling good about themselves in the day-to-day, this idea of flow in the moment, and avoiding more awkward or harsh emotional situations. That'll suit more FE and SI in socionics. And if they also like the idea of exploring theories, putting together different ideas, being open to questioning on their structures which they're trying to put together and make sense of, that also suits NE and TI. So that's something that I'd share very much. And also an ISFJ, very conversely, would also share. They'd have different elements and emphases. One may be more, an ISFJ shows all the alpha values, but it's probably the least confident in that extrovert's intuition. So approaching lots of different ideas themselves and easily finding new ways to explore unseen territory. But they'd have an appreciation for it, and they more likely show the other elements more strongly. Whether it's introverted thinking and their systemizing and making sense of a world, whether that's in their introverted sensation, want to create that flow and harmony in the moment, and in their extroverted ethics in terms of actually creating with introverted sensation, it's the idea of positive emotionality, positive moods, having a positive psychology approach. Does that make sense? Is there anything else you wanted to ask on that?
Yeah, the reason I wanted to ask you that question now was because when you asked me those questions, it felt like you follow a very similar structure to what I always advocate, which is instead of focusing on the superficial traits, like how they answer on different questions that you prepared in the beginning, or how they tend to act normally, or how they appear to you, you focus on deep dive questions that get people to that are more organic in their nature, that get people to really reflect on, okay, what do I like, where do I come from? And those questions I feel are much more meaningful and say a lot more about a person than their rehearsed explanations about themselves. People have a lot of go-to ideas about themselves, and some of those can be correct, but a lot of them are false and are stereotypical, things they've told themselves for a long time because of their role in society or to other people.
I think there's a lot to be said about that. There's something look, when I first started out, I would say looking back at myself now and someone who I was when I first started, I'd say I was quite suckish at interviews. I thought I made quite a few pitfalls and mistakes. One of the things I did, which was not good, was that I often assumed that what someone said about themselves wasn't necessarily who they were. Now, I learned quite quickly, my friend at the time, Rowan, also helped point this out, that it's what people do that makes more sense than what they necessarily say. Some people can be very deluded. I still say, in answer to this other question you asked me when you submitted these questions, I think that you know when you got something right, when you've got that synergy and alignment of the person's self-perception and also the perception of the interviewer and even the perception of others. When you've got a narrative which explains these different parts of a person in terms of how they're perceived from different vantage points, I think you've got a good idea of the type. And the second pitfall I found was when someone says something completely sincerely, completely honestly, you may still misinterpret that because they may have had a way of understanding a word differently to you. If someone says, for instance, oh, I want to be a light to others. Now, someone like C.S. Joseph may say, oh, be a light, that's an FE thing, cross off on the whiteboard without any further discussion or thought on the matter. Whereas I'd say, okay, what does that mean? And I get them to explain that. And by doing that, I can often find a very different interpretations to what I would have expected on the superficial reading. And that's a technique once I learned that, I thought that my interviews became richer.
I can imagine that. Now, something I've noticed is, well, my girlfriend was one that said that she has read a lot of descriptions on the ENFP personality type online, of course, and she hasn't related to many of them. The only one she has related to was the Socionics description of the ENFP. And I thought about that and looked at it a little bit and tried to understand like why that was. And I noticed that you write personality descriptions in a very similar way to how I tend to write them. But basically what you focus on is the motivation, you know, where a standard ENFP description will be like, oh, they're outgoing, social, love to talk to people, like partying, like being different, often dressed in a strange way. You know, the ENFP description on your site is one that goes, the ENFP is primarily motivated by, and so on and so forth. So that immediately connected much more for her than, you know, the superficial stereotype you get on 16 personalities or traditional MBTI.
There's something I noticed in terms of mistyping. I found a lot of people who I'd say are ENFJ typing themselves as ENFP.
Yeah.
I think it's because there's a lack of distinguishing in terms of what extroverted feeling means as opposed to extrovert intuition with introverted feeling. And I find that as a result, the ENFPs they tend to be advocates and to be striving to stand out, to represent other people, to make an impact or image on others. Whereas when it goes to Socionics, we're looking at the ENFP as more of a delta type. It's really about their exploration of perspectives, understanding why people are thinking the way that they're thinking. And when it comes to extroverted feeling as a demonstrative function, it's not that they value having that sort of emotional impact on others. They value creating a certain image. It's just that they happen to have lots of emotional energy and that they are very able to come across well to others if they want to.
Yeah. The way I see it, and this is where I bring in the 8 additional cognitive functions that I talk about: intuitive perceiving and feeling perceiving, versus in this case, intuitive judging and feeling judging. The ENFP relates to the democratic level of extroverted feeling, you know, asking people for their opinion. What do you like about this? Do you like that? Do you think differently about this? But then they still respond to the feeling perceiving individuality and authenticity, which is what is my way? What do I feel? Often I feel an ENFP will ask me, my girlfriend will ask me, what do you think about this? But if she disagrees with me and she has a personal opinion on this that's different, of course she's going to stick to that definition and that idea, and she still wants to do that first. But still she's interested in, and she wants to have the people with her and to have people back her and say and validate and say, yeah, I like that too, and I think that's great as well. And that's why I think a lot of ENFPs also can feel a bit like outsiders, like they're so aware of what everyone thinks and also how different they are.
Yeah, I mean, they're not. That's the thing. There's this free spirit aspect of an ENFP. They want that self-sufficiency rather than necessarily being entirely involved and belonging to any particular group or category. And at the end of the day, when it comes to interacting with others, it's more of that interest in individuals and their individual perspectives which drives them. And there's a thing that I think it's also something that you've latched onto, which I think is very insightful. And we have this in Socionics. It's the idea of a fluid interplay between what we say as the creative and demonstrative functions. Now, let's take the ENFP because we've got the ENFP. So it's very clear they got their leading extrovert intuition, that main motivations with exploring different perspectives, finding new ideas and ways of looking at the world. And we know that that is flavored with introverted feelings, so focus more about personal perspectives, the individual insights people have to offer, and getting to know people through relationships to find out those perspectives. But that interplay between relationships and then emotions, emotional expression, is very fluid for the ENFP and also the SFP. The idea that they're very good at engaging with other people, very good at coming across well and in a likable way to other people, in order to then form pretty much any relationship they want with any person. And then it has that interplay between, first of all, emotional expressiveness, but also that integrity towards the people they like and, let's say, don't like so much. And you can see again with, say, it's quite again with the INFJ, in that similarly, although you be focused on more of the extroverted feeling, the emotional expression, you also do it very much through the one-to-one and getting to know and building those relationships to then improve your influence.
Yeah, like the way I see it, extroverted feeling is the aspirational role in the INFJ. Like, it's something you always work towards, but you never address it directly. Like the way you see it with ENFJs is they address the people directly and say we, but an INFJ is very uncomfortable doing that. The INFJ is much more comfortable getting everyone along on the individual level first, and then hopefully the people will come together once you've done that one-on-one with those people that you saw were having trouble or issues with this.
Yes.
Once you figured out what was wrong for them, what they struggle with, once you won them over, then the people would be won over too. So it's kind of like winning over the people one person at a time versus winning over the people by going out and by being very persuasive. It's almost like I have like an iffiness about it, because I feel like I know how peer pressure works a lot of the time, and how people can say yes to something just because they assume everyone else is going to say yes to it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Now, I know that didn't you bring up your ENFP relationship in your discussion last night with Damon and Pukoki and all the rest? And were they sort of surprised by you having that relationship?
Yeah, I don't think people should be surprised, because I think the INFJ and the ENFP relationship is very commonly mentioned online and very in-depth explored. There's a lot of other YouTubers that talk about it. Like earlier today, I was watching Very Merry Videos, which is a smaller YouTuber. She makes like lots of great videos about being an ENFP, living with an INFJ. And she captures that dynamic really well. The way I see it, yeah, we are very different people, INFJs and ENFPs. We are very different people on a practical level, in our attitude to things, how we tend to do things, our approach to decision making, and to most things, there's a lot of misunderstanding in that, especially in the beginning. Like there can be that idea that because it's different, it's wrong. And that can be very common.
Well, I'd be interested to look at it. What are these differences? How do they look like?
So one thing is, of course, the ENFP with extroverted intuition has such a huge need for freedom and for novel ideas and for the unusual and peculiar things that happen around them. And here I feel often I'm the one that pulls the brakes on her in this. Like I am the one that wants to know before I dive in. I want to understand it. And I am okay just being able to understand it. I don't actually need to go out and do it. As long as I understand it, then it's almost good for me. But my ENFP girlfriend is the one that kind of pushes me to go out and try it as well, not just to understand it and observe it from a distance, but to go out and try it for myself. In that way, I felt she's very conducive to my growth.
To put those ideas into practice, as it were.
Yes, that's right.
Interesting. Because I think that there's always I don't know, like, well, at least in the Socionics theory, if we follow it very strictly, we have this idea of introvert intuition, extrovert intuition not being so compatible. Now, the question is how accurate that is. I guess the question is also, when you look at introverted intuition, extrovert intuition, at least how the socionists have defined it, extrovert intuition has that sort of growth of possibilities, the idea of exploring new outcomes, being open to changing your mind, because there's always a chance you may be wrong in whatever you thought about, and trying to, see things that other people aren't readily looking at, looking under the surface. If a certain facade looks to be untrustworthy, it's the extrovert intuition which says, oh, but maybe it's misunderstood. Maybe there's something else to look at there.
Yeah.
Now, whereas introvert intuition, at least in the Socionics system, is actually more about narrowing the range of possibilities. It's actually saying, I don't want these trivial distractions. I want the thing which is of greatest importance and meaning. I'm going to essentially dedicate the aspects of my life to that thing of greatest meaning and purpose, and talk about things as if they're inevitable. That they, it's not a question of things maybe being changed or changing your mind. This is going to happen almost necessarily, and there's not much you can do about it unless you take action now to change that. And one would have imagined that an introvert intuition approach of that inevitability might clash with the idea of possibility from extrovert intuition. Is that a clash you've perceived? Is that a clash you've seen?
Yeah, definitely. I feel in some ways dating an ENFP is like a socialist dating a conservative, or something similar uh, in that approach to things, and in that clash. I obviously can get very much tunnel vision on like this one idea. How I was talking earlier about how I'm searching for that the most purest representation of that individual cognitive function or that archetype, and how I'm looking for that key, like one thing to understand it all. Where often I find that how ENFPs understand personality psychology is almost like, I don't know, it's like magic. Like often I find it's too wide, and it's too open-ended and too loose. So I don't actually understand how it works. But the thing I've had to recognize over time as I've gotten to know her is it does work. Somehow it does work. And somehow she is able to tie out what I see as a million bunches of loose ends. And she's still able to get the right answer. We agree on a surprising amount of people to be the same personality type. And here I feel the inspirational relationship, which I see between INFJs and ENFPs, is about vulnerability. And that's basically, accepting that you don't know everything, you don't have the answer to every question, and you have to accept that, like, rabbit chase of the ENFP, and understand that while it looks wrong to you, the attitude, the approach looks different, it might still lead you right where you need to be, and it might get you to the right answer anyway.
That's also very interesting. Also, but curiously, though, I actually relate to a lot of what you said about yourself in that regard. Like, I would say that when it comes, this is something which I've got a good friend called Peter, right? Very much involved in sociology. Been involved in it since 2005. Now, something he always say about me is that we share a lot of interest in socionics, like socionics and history, quadricycles, all that sort of stuff. But he will say to me that one of our differences is that he prefers a more pragmatic approach to the functions. Keep the theory light and just find a few things which work and use them to type. Whereas for me, I try to dive right in to understand the precise formulations of, say, a cognitive function. I'm really into that systematic way of understanding how it fits together in a logical way. And what you described there about really diving in to really understand its cognitive function, something that hit a point of resonance with me. So I'm wondering, is that really introverted intuition, or could it maybe even be introverted thinking? The Peter would be an extroverted thinking type, I should say, and that's where he'd always said to me, "Oh, that's your introverted thinking. You're getting involved in this systematic internal consistency because of your TI rather than anything to do with NI."
So the way I see that, I think that would be feeling, judging, and thinking and perceiving. I think that explains a lot when it comes to our decision making, and how we want to organize things.
So could you just explain a bit more about feeling, judging, and feeling, perceiving?
So feeling and judging is, to me, the archetype of the caregiving type, and thinking, perceiving is the archetype of a hacker, or a player, or somebody that sees things as a merchant. You can see it as the archetype of a merchant, like a person that likes to trade back and forth, this for that much, this at that value. So when you're an INFJ or an ENTP, you obviously balance like the opposite ends of those two things. The INFJ tends to struggle the most with thinking and perceiving. Like that's our biggest weakness in many ways in our lives. And it's the one thing that we feel very unconfident with. So it can be something that we try to peacock a lot, to borrow a term from objective personality.
Interesting. Okay, right. Okay, that's the thing. When I think of thinking perceiving, I wouldn't think of a merchant, but I would see that side in terms of, say, an ESTP or an ENTP's demonstrative extroverted thinking. That's the thing. When we get to our idea of TP and say what all TI types have in common, say an INTP. Would an INTP be so mercantile? I'm not sure. I think it's
what you see in them is the argumentative state, you know, of everything is an argument, everything is pro or con. Like TP balances pros and cons. It weighs and tests, this is better than that for that and that reason, but it's worse for that and that reason. So that's what I see all TP types doing, from ESTPs to INTPs.
Okay, but I guess also because what do all TP types have in common? And there'll be that, well, I don't know, from maybe not so much from your perspective, fair enough, because you don't really have, say, creative functions in the Neojungian perspective, and I completely respect that. But I've seen that looking at introverted thinking in, say, an ENTP or shared with an INTP in, say, the MBTI and Socionics, you see that being about internal consistency. It's not so much about weighing pros or cons, how something will end up working, whether it brings better benefit or less benefit. It's more about, does it make internal sense? And that's something which, at least for me, that's also something which I've identified very much with. It's also why I would sort of dive into understanding these cognitive functions with such precision. Is because I want every little bit and piece in my theory to line up almost perfectly and harmoniously. And it seems to me that you're doing that as well.
Yeah, and here's like something I've tried to explain or understand for myself for a while, and if you can figure that out for me,
yeah,
I'm gonna need to wrap up this stream. And
we're going on from now, haven't we? Sorry about that.
But I'll finish this thought. I've been thinking for a long time about how to explain the similarities that sometimes occur between, for example, INFJs and ENTPs. Because obviously I've noticed that the ENTP is kind of like a mix of the inspirational aspects of an ENFP and the dual aspects of an ESTP for an INFJ. So somehow you mix those two traits in one, and somehow there is a lot of common ground that I find really fascinating, but I can't really explain it or where it happens, and I haven't gotten that far, at least so far.
I think it might be because you may have chopped off a few needed toes of the model in your theory, causing certain aspects of the type to hobble. If I were to expand, look, for instance, you're talking about my extrovert intuition, you're talking about my intuitive perceiving, you're talking about my thinking perceiving, you're talking about my extroverted thinking. You're not talking about my extroverted feeling. And that's really a thing. Like for me, but you did mention it in the profile. You talked about my desire to convey enthusiasm and to impress others to some degree, to have an emotional effect on other people. I like to perform. I like to make people happy. And that in socionics is easily explained. It's my mobilizing function, the thing I aspire to become better at, a bit like the tertiary function in Myers-Briggs type indicator. This idea that I want to actually have an emotional effect on people. And sometimes I come across like an absolute dick.
Oh, no.
Oh, there, you're right. That's okay. I don't want to keep you for too long, though. I know you got to go. But, oh, he's disappeared. Oh, he's back. Yeah. Sometimes I come across like a dick because I've trodden people's personal sensitivities, you know, more introverted feeling territory, which I can't do. But I want to do well in the extroverted feeling. I want to get that response from other people that's positive. And that's what I think is missing structurally from a description of ENTP, even though it comes out in your actual descriptions without you referring to a particular cognitive function?
Yeah, it might be that there's maths that I'm missing, or it's a matter of development or mindset, or there's another dimension of personality type beyond what I'm exploring that I don't have integrated in the system. Or there might be that there are similarities. However, I feel like even if an ENTP does have extroverted feeling, like every personality type in my head has every single cognitive function in some role or form.
Yes.
The form is still different, isn't it? So your extroverted feeling is something you come to more like for out of a childish sense of fun. Like the ENTP's extroverted feeling is usually something that's expressed more like relief or an outlet, or like a fun, like, oh, way to, hey, how can I make a joke to make everyone happy, you know? But for an INFJ, extroverted feeling is something super serious, you know. So the way we come at it is like it's like one of the most important things that you have to really be careful with, and you don't want to upset it in any way or say something that will hurt it. And you have to show the utmost care to make sure it works out. So it's still very different, but perhaps that is the explanation at the same time.
Would you say, now that's an interesting distinction. Now there might, I'm feeling a bit of conflation there. Let me explain. So childish in terms of my approach, in other words, not really paying so much attention to people's personal sensitivities. Yes, I think that makes a lot of sense. In terms of the actual emotions I want to convey, being more playful and being more light-hearted, right? I'm not sure if that, and as a result, the opposite, you being very serious in your emotions, you conveying serious emotions. I don't think, is that the case that you say that people tend to see as a very sort of serious person who conveys very serious emotions?
Yeah.
Okay, now fair enough. It's just something which, so Vince, I've noticed in people often type Robin Williams, late Robin Williams, as an ENFP, right?
Yeah.
Now we've always thought, actually he's more of an ESFJ. But either way, this idea of playful, childish emotions is something he's very good at engaging with. And he does it masterfully. He doesn't muck up in the way I sometimes do. And we would have thought maybe that's a good example of FE plus SI with some NE. And that is that the childish is not necessarily the weakness. The likely to mess up in it is more of a weakness, being in a tertiary position. Right. Whereas in a strong position, it can still be playful. It just has extrovert intuition in it as well, and that positive flow of introvert sensation.
This is a really interesting discussion. We should continue. But
okay, fair enough.
I want to zoom out.
Okay, fine. I'm going to finish on one little point, and that's this. There's been a little bit of gossip. And the gossip is after your discussion with some of the betas. So people thought that, is it the case that Erik is an IEI in the Socionics system necessarily? Now, I've wondered about this myself, and from our discussion, I'm starting to wonder that myself. And I'm thinking to myself, well, I don't see any weakness in extroverted sensation. I do see an absence of value in extroverted sensation. And also, looking through your website, your focus on sort of bringing out people's growth and development, having a positive psychology, and even the nice faces you have of your archetypes, I must say, it seems to me to suggest more of an introverted sensation motivation, purely from a Socionics definition, not from a Myers-Briggs definition, or from your own definition in Neojungian. So I would wonder about exploring maybe an SEI typing. And if so, it may also explain why you can connect a lot better with an ENFP girlfriend.
Maybe that's the case. I can't confirm or deny it. I can say I've looked at the types in Socionics, and IEI has been the one that I felt was sorry. I'm very the INFJ version of the Socionics types has been the one that I felt fit me the best. But there were some discrepancies and some differences. And I also looked at ENTP in Socionics as an option for myself. So I have not looked at ISFJ, but I'll look at it.
Figure out, because I think also that Imagine an SEI, but with high intelligence and high openness in the sense of a big five. That sort of thing I'm sort of feeling out at the moment, but we'll find out. I know I'm keeping you. It's been an absolute pleasure, Erik, and I hope you have a really lovely rest of your evening. And we should do it again sometime.
Sorry I was a bit late. We had a bit of a miscommunication about the time.
No, it's fine. It's probably me, my poor detail awareness, and not registering the update of the time. It's fine. I muck up sometimes. I'm a bit of an idiot in that respect. But it was an absolute pleasure, Erik. And yeah, I had a really good conversation.
Yeah, it was great. Thanks a lot for inviting me, and see you all. Thanks for joining in the chat, everyone.
Take care now. Bye-bye. And bye-bye to everyone who had the interest to view. And thank you for viewing.